So first, I just want to thank all the folks at Mary for inviting me to speak in this wonderful lecture series in honor of Rachel Carson. And also thanks to all of you for choosing to spend your evening listening to a talk about trash. Maybe not the most appealing of topics, but as it's known to those of us in the biz, we like to refer to it as marine debris. So marine debris research is really at the intersection of environmental science, polymer chemistry, waste management, marine biology, ecology, and oceanography. And it has important aspects of social science tied in there as well. So the topic is quite interesting from that perspective, but it's also a topic that's really fueled by impassioned ocean advocates and also anti-plastic activists. And as such, it receives an enormous amount of attention from the general public. So again, sort of very interesting domain in which to work scientifically, but also because of that public attention. Unfortunately, much of the public attention, much of the information that you'll find, that the public will find on the web or in the media, and in just the public conception of the problem really is not accurate. So in my work, I've found that many academics and really even marine scientists share these misconceptions. And as a colleague of mine recently put it, even smart people get it wrong. So you shouldn't feel bad if you share these misconceptions. It's just a factor of the information that's available out there. And the fact that the information out there is incomplete is not necessarily because this contaminant, marine debris or plastic in the ocean, is a new contaminant, but instead really the science of this contaminant is really just emerging. So my goal today is to present to you my perspective on the state of this science and to convince you that while there at this point may be many more questions than there are answers, we must not wait for those answers before working to find solutions to this problem. So I have to begin by talking about what this environmental problem is not, because I'm sure that some of you in the room have heard very little to nothing about marine debris, or if you have, you may only know about the so-called Great Pacific Garbage Patch. Are there people in the room that have heard this term, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch? Okay, quite a few people. Yeah, and you may have heard phrases in regards to the garbage patch or the Great Atlantic Garbage Patch, its cousin. You may have heard things about piles of trash or floating landfills, or masses of garbage so thick that you could easily walk across it. And images like these are all over the web. These images perpetuate common misconceptions. There is no floating landfill that you can walk on. There is no mound of trash. And so I just urge you to be wary when you see photos like this. That's not to say that these photos are not real photos, but they're generally not attributed. They don't give you a caption telling you where they're taken. So it's entirely possible that, well, this to me looks photoshopped, but you know, it's entirely possible that there is a part of the world where there is such a trash dump, but chances are it's very coastal. That's not to say it's not a problem, but when people talk about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, they're talking about what's out there in the open ocean. And in the open ocean, you don't see anything that looks like this. Now, it's, again, nothing to feel bad about if you feel misled, because there are even very reputable people, such as Oprah Winfrey, who use these images. And in fact, she says this is the most shocking thing she's ever seen. And we know that Oprah has seen a lot. So that's quite something to say. Okay, so we're just going to start by erasing those images from your mind. So instead, in the part of the ocean that's referred to as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, or the Great Atlantic Garbage Patch, what you'll typically see from the deck of a ship is something like this. You see calm seas, light winds, generally nothing but sky and ocean and horizon. Now, sometimes in these parts of the ocean, an object will float by, and sometimes these things are distinguishable, like this upside-down boot or a 5-gallon bucket. Other times, things are not very distinguishable. It appears that these are some fishing buoys on the left, some kind of container. And this was a photo taken just a couple days ago from our ship in the North Pacific. This is a 3-foot-long piece of styrofoam that is flanked on the bottom side, completely covered by barnacles with a little crab floating on top, crawling on top. So most of the debris, you will see debris like this in parts of the ocean, but most of the debris that's present is not easily visible from the deck of a ship, let alone from aircraft or satellites. And that's because it consists of typically millimeter-sized pieces of plastic. Now, that's not to say that just because these pieces are small, that this is not a contaminant and that it's not a problem. It is. So let's back up just a second and talk about what exactly is marine debris. It's not a very descriptive term. Marine debris is defined as any solid man-made material that persists in the marine environment. And that marine environment includes beaches and shorelines, the water column, and the seafloor, as illustrated in some of these pictures. So we see Camilo Beach, which is quite a famous beach on the southern part of the Big Island of Hawaii, where large amounts of debris wash up every year. These are some photos that we've taken from our ships. And then these are some photos from the seafloor. These are probably hard to make out, but these are water bottles sitting in a canyon in the Mediterranean at 1,000 meters deep. And these are actually plastic bags that are underneath Fram Strait in the Arctic at about more than 2,000 meters depth. So marine debris can be composed of any solid material. It can be composed of metal, glass, fibers, paper, cardboard, wood, and yes, plastic. It is estimated, although very loosely, that about 60 to 80% of marine debris is composed of plastic. But most of the studies in the open ocean have focused on debris that's floating on the sea surface. And what has been found there is almost entirely plastic. Likewise, plastic is the most abundant material that's collected in beach samples and beach cleanups. So most of the work in the field of marine debris is focused on plastic in the marine environment, and that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. So the first scientific reports of plastic debris floating in the ocean were actually published in the 1970s, in the early 70s, for both the Pacific, North Pacific, and North Atlantic Ocean. So this is not a new phenomenon. As you know, plastic is by design a very strong and durable material that's resistant to biodegradation. And because of these properties, it's very persistent in the environment, whether that be the marine environment or the land environment. In the ocean, the lifetime of plastic is not well known. We know that exposure to ultraviolet radiation, to sunlight at the sea surface or on beaches, will act to weaken the material. And then when it's tumbled about in waves or in the motion of the tides on beaches, that weakened material will break up into smaller and smaller pieces. But to the best of our knowledge, this material continues breaking down into microscopic sized pieces and remains plastic. It doesn't actually break down in the environment. So I've structured my talk according to what I think are the major driving questions in plastic marine debris research right now. And these are, you're going to find, very basic questions. The first question, how big is the problem? So if you want to estimate the amount of plastic debris in the marine environment, you could imagine doing one of two things. One, you could try to estimate the inputs of plastic, identify how plastic is getting into the marine environment and try to quantify that. And secondly, you could go into the marine environment and try to measure it directly. So first, what I want to do is to consider the inputs, or the sources of plastic to the marine environment. So there are a multitude of pathways for debris of any kind to enter the marine environment, and these will be familiar to you. They originate on land and at sea. So on land, any kind of litter can enter the ocean. You can imagine beach litter left by beachgoers can be carried out by the outgoing tide. Any kind of litter that is on land will probably ultimately make its way into some kind of waterway. So rivers and waterways will ultimately drain into the ocean. And you see here a picture of the Los Angeles River following a strong storm. There's a boom that's actually trapping this immense amount of debris so that it doesn't enter the ocean. Also drainage outflows and runoff, again, places where water is going to wash off the land into the ocean. And then winds can also transport litter to the ocean, typically during storms. And then another category that's very obvious, especially following the Japanese tsunami, is catastrophic events. So obviously a tremendous amount of debris of all kinds enters the ocean during a tsunami or a hurricane or massive flooding. We also can have sources of marine debris that originate at sea, or by activities at sea. So from ships and at-sea platforms, there may be dumping that is either intentional or not intentional. Lost cargo, you hear about shipping containers being lost, containers full of rubber duckies or Nike sneakers that wash up on beaches. Fishing and aquaculture activities. So fishing gear, as you all know, gets lost. Aquaculture also has different types of pieces, equipment that they use that can get lost to the ocean. Then there are things like recreational activities. Boaters, people who are out fishing or diving may lose litter over the side into the ocean. And yes, oceanographic activities. A lot of what we do as oceanographers is deploy equipment into the marine environment and watch it behave. And much of that equipment does contain plastic, so we are not immune. So none of these are easily quantified. They're very widespread, and I don't believe at this point we have the evidence to even say which are the top 3 pathways of debris in the ocean, especially when you consider something like a catastrophic event. How do you compare that to the amount of litter that washes off of a beach? So this is really a big hole in our understanding. And as of right now, I don't think we can estimate how much plastic is entering the ocean based on the input rate. I should mention that it is, since 1988, illegal to dump plastic of any kind into any part of the ocean. And this was due to an international regulation called MARPOL Annex 5, instituted by the International Maritime Organization. So it's illegal to dump, but as you might imagine, this is a very difficult rule to enforce. So the ocean is a very big place. You can't police the entire ocean. So it's possible and probable that intentional dumping does still occur, and certainly unintentional loss does persist at sea. This also doesn't address any kind of input from land. And as we mentioned, that we don't know the lifetime of plastic in the ocean, but it certainly is years to decades and potentially even to centuries. So this continues to be an environmental problem. So because we can't estimate the inputs into the ocean of plastic, we'll turn to environmental observations. And this is really the heart of the work that we've been doing at Sea Education Association. So the longest and the most extensive data set on floating plastic debris in the open ocean has been collected by undergraduate students and faculty scientists at Sea Education Association in the Western North Atlantic and the Caribbean Sea since the mid-1980s. We also have a ship that operates in the Pacific that's been collecting plastic data for about a decade now. If you're not familiar with Sea Education Association, or SCA, we are the only organization in the United States that offers opportunities to undergraduates to conduct open ocean research on atoll sailing ships, such as the Corwith Kramer, which is pictured here. And the Kramer operates in the North Atlantic and Caribbean, and we also have the ship, the Robert C. Siemens, which operates in the Pacific Ocean. SEA is a nonprofit educational institution. We were founded in 1971, and we're located in Woods Hole, Massachusetts on the Cape. And our primary mission is to educate undergraduates through our Sea Semester program. So students come to us from across the country to spend 12 weeks of their college career with us. And they take an academic program that integrates marine science, maritime, literature, history, and policy, and practical seamanship together with deep water oceanographic research experience. So students come to our campus, they take coursework in these topics, and they develop a research project that they'll carry out on board the ship during a 6-week research cruise. So they sail on our ships, which are outfitted for oceanographic research through funding from the National Science Foundation and NASA and other institutions. So the data set that I'm going to present was collected on approximately 180 typically 6-week-long Sea Semester programs conducted from between 1986 and 2010. The data I'll present were collected in the Western North Atlantic and the Caribbean Sea from Newfoundland down to the Southern Caribbean Sea. And what I'm showing here is a typical set of cruise tracks for a 1-year period. So in the fall, the ship actually has just left, well, typically leaves Woods Hole, but the ship left Rockland, Maine this year, where it was in a yard period a little bit long. So the ship leaves from New England, sails south to the Caribbean and to St. Croix. And then we spend the winter and the early spring on a circuit through the Caribbean Sea and the Southern Sargasso Sea. And then in late spring, the ship sails back north, where we spend time in the summer up in the New England area. So these cruise tracks are repeated annually, and the data that I'm presenting here were collected by more than 4,000 undergraduate students, mainly undergraduate students. We do have some high school programs as well in the summer. And this was conducted by the students under the guidance of the faculty scientists and really in support of their student research projects that the students designed themselves. And I should say that I do think it's truly unprecedented for undergraduates to be primarily responsible for such an important baseline data set, such as the one that I'm going to talk about now. So on every Sea Semester cruise, we routinely tow a surface plankton net called a Nustan Net at the sea surface, and that's shown here. And we do that to collect biological organisms, seaweeds, anything else that's floating at the sea surface. So the net is shown here, has a 1 meter wide mouth, and it's half a meter tall. The mesh of the net is 335 microns, which is about 1/3 of a millimeter. And we typically tow the net for 30 minutes at a ship speed of 2 knots, which means that we filter essentially a 1 meter wide by almost 2 kilometer long swath of the sea surface. And if you think about the idea that the net is filtering water, it's filtering an amount equivalent to approximately 2,000 bathtubs of water. So that's 120,000 gallons by my calculation. Once aboard, the contents of the net and the cod end jar, the collection jar at the end, are poured into a bucket and then into a sieve. And then this is where the undergraduates are very important. They spend time picking through all of the contents of the net to identify plastic pieces, to separate them, enumerate them, and then archive them. We then take the total number of plastic pieces collected in a single net tow, and we divide that by the tow area. So that's the width of the net times the length of the tow. And that gives us units of plastic concentration in units of numbers of pieces per square kilometer. So that's a normalized value that we can use to compare across locations. So as I said earlier, plastic debris is not collecting in an enormous floating mass. And in fact, the majority of the debris is typically not visible by eye from the deck of the ship unless A, you know what you're looking for, and B, it's a very calm day. So what I'm showing here are examples of typical samples. Each of these were collected in a single net tow in the areas of highest plastic concentration, one from the North Pacific and one from the North Atlantic. And for a sense of scale, we have a sieve here, and there's a person holding some tweezers. And on the right, this is actually a petri dish that the sample is sitting in. So as you can see, most of the pieces are millimeter sized. They're irregularly shaped. They look weathered. They come in various colors. And so this indicates to us that they are originating from some larger item that has fragmented. It's important to note that we can't determine their origin from the pieces themselves. So that means we can't tell if this came from a bottle or a jug or a bucket. We can't tell the type of item that it came from. And we also have no way of identifying the geographic location where this originated. They're just too small. The only exceptions are bits of polypropylene line, which are pretty easily identifiable and most likely were pieces of fishing line. And we also can identify industrial resin pellets, which is kind of the raw material of plastic production. The plastic resin manufacturers produce these pellets and then ship them to converters who create the consumer products that you and I use. They put color and other additives in and mold them into consumer products. So we can tell these resin pellets pretty easily. They're pretty uniform in size, and I'll show you a picture of those later. From laboratory analyses on a subset of our samples, we were able to determine that the majority of the plastic pieces we collect are made up of 3 different plastics. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the quote-unquote recycling codes that you find on the bottom of a lot of your products. These are actually resin codes. They indicate the material that the plastic is made of. And the 3 materials that we collect are high-density polyethylene, or number 2, low-density polyethylene, or number 4, and polypropylene, which is number 5. And the reason that we collect these is that these plastics are actually less dense than seawater, which means that they float. So this is a good check that we're actually sampling what we think we should be, because we're collecting all of our samples at the sea surface. So we expect to find floating materials. The kinds of consumer products that are made up of these materials include things like milk jugs, plastic grocery bags, bread and produce bags, dairy containers, bottle caps. So these are things that you and I use every single day. One thing that's interesting that is not in this category is your plastic water bottle. So this kind of bottle, or soda bottle, soft drink bottle, is made of PET. That's number 1, and that is actually denser than seawater. So one of the big questions is, where do all the water bottles go? Probably on the seafloor somewhere. To give you a sense of the size of the samples that I'm showing here, in the Petri dish sample on the right, there are actually 240 individual pieces of plastic. And when we do that conversion to plastic concentration, that gives us a concentration of 130,000 pieces per kilometer squared. So this is a pretty large number if you try to sort of picture what that means, but for 1 square kilometer of ocean. And it's a large sample. It's a high concentration of plastic. But as you can see, this is not a large volume of plastic. It's not a large mass of plastic. So these 240 pieces would easily fit in the palm of your hand. So where do we find all of these small plastic pieces? What I'm showing here is a map of the entire SEA data set that was collected from 1986 to 2010. So we're looking at the western North Atlantic Ocean here. Here's the US, South America. Each dot indicates the location of a single plankton net toe at the sea surface, and it's shaded according to the color. The color shading is according to the concentration of plastic in units of pieces per kilometer squared. So the darkest blues, which may be hard to distinguish, are net toes where there was 0 plastic collected. The warm colors are the highest concentrations, and the black stars are the top concentrations at greater than 200,000 pieces per kilometer squared. So you'll notice that the bulk of the symbols occur sort of on this half of the picture. There's a separate cruise track over here. These were the samples collected on our sea semester cruises that are annually repeating. And this cruise track is the track of a dedicated research expedition that we did in the summer of 2010 called the Plastics at Sea North Atlantic Expedition. And we actually did this sawtooth pattern. I'll come back to that in just a second. So that's a standalone cruise. In total, this figure represents more than 110,000 individual pieces of plastic that were picked out of the nets by students. And of all of these net toes, more than 6,600 toes, 63% of them contained some amount of plastic. So what I'd like you to do is to sort of describe in your mind where the highest concentrations occur. You might expect to find the highest concentrations along the coastline because it's sensible to think that a lot of this plastic is entering from land. But in fact, the highest concentrations, the reds and the black stars, are occurring far from land, and they're really concentrated here in the subtropical latitudes. In fact, the concentration in the subtropics in the Sargasso Sea, which is this part of the Atlantic, is much higher than the concentrations in the Caribbean or in the Gulf of Maine, for instance. In fact, the one green star that you see over here indicates what, to my knowledge, is the highest concentration of plastic ever recorded, and that's equivalent to a concentration of 26 million pieces per kilometer squared. This particular net toe had a sample containing more than 23,000 individual pieces of plastic. I think they stopped counting somewhere around 15,000 and had to estimate the rest because people were threatening to jump overboard. So 26 million pieces per kilometer squared. And this sample, you'll notice, is just about as far from land as you can get. It's 2,000 meters from Bermuda, 2,000 kilometers from Bermuda, and 3,000 kilometers from the east coast of the US. So this concentration, the highest plastic concentration here in the subtropical latitudes, we call that the accumulation zone. This is what people are referring to when they talk about the garbage patch. So the Plastics at Sea expedition, the goal of this, before we did that, we only had data up to here, and we asked ourselves, how far does this high concentration zone extend to the east? So what we did was we went as far as we could in 6 weeks along 32 degrees north, and we tried to map out that concentration zone as we went back. And what you can see is that obviously the concentrations didn't decrease at all. If anything, they did increase as you go east across the Atlantic. So we still don't know how far east the high plastic extends. It could very well go fully across the basin. So the big question is, why is the plastic accumulating in this region? And the answer here turns to ocean circulation, which is where my background is of use. So what we did was we went out and looked for the best data set that represents surface ocean currents. And what I'm showing here is putting together those data with the surface plastic concentration that I just showed you in that map a slide ago. So what we did is we took those 6,600 dots and we averaged them into bins, and then we smoothed them. So what you're looking at in the colors is a map of sort of spatially averaged plastic concentration. So what you can see is this is that high concentration zone here, and this especially shows that the highest plastic concentrations were observed on that one single cruise track out to the middle of the Atlantic. Now the sort of freaky running dog figure over here, this black contour, what that represents is the region where the surface ocean currents have a speed of 2 centimeters per second or less. So this is a very, very sluggish part of the ocean. So all in here we have very slow ocean currents, and this is in fact referred to as the subtropical convergence zone. So because of the way that the wind patterns interact with the sea surface, this causes the ocean currents to actually be coming together or converging right at about 30 degrees north. So when the currents are coming together and slowing, they're carrying anything that's floating at the sea surface with them, and it essentially makes this part of the ocean kind of a dead end. Anything that ends up in this subtropical convergence zone is pretty much stuck there. So when we overlay the contour, the surface current contour over the plastic concentration map, this really shows quite clearly the correspondence between the two. So we infer that the reason this pattern exists is in fact due to the surface currents. So using the map of average plastic concentration, the color shading that you see here, we were also able to estimate for the first time a lower bound on the average amount of plastic debris floating at the surface in the western North Atlantic. And the number that we calculated from this map is 1,100 metric tons. Whether that's a big number or not to you, it is 1,100 metric tons of plastic that did not originate in the ocean. It's important to note that is a lower bound. There is surely more plastic in the ocean than that because we are only reporting plastic floating at the surface, and we've now done some work that shows that the wind, when it blows strongly, can actually mix plastic to below the sea surface. So when we tow our net, we're missing that plastic that is now tens of meters mixed below the sea surface. We also are only measuring, remember, pieces of plastic that are larger than about a third of a millimeter in size. So if plastic breaks into smaller pieces, it would pass through the net and we wouldn't capture it. It's also important to note that while this surface circulation explains why the plastic is accumulating in the area, it can't really help us figure out how long the plastic has been there or where it came from. So that still remains an open question of who to blame. So the physics, the wind patterns that are driving the ocean currents that cause the plastic to accumulate in the subtropical latitudes of the North Atlantic are also at work in the other subtropical ocean basins. What this figure shows is the result of a computer model that was constructed by Nikolai Maximenko at the University of Hawaii. And what he did was he took data from surface buoys that drift with ocean currents, and he turned that into a numerical model of the ocean circulation. What he did was he wanted to investigate where these surface currents would carry debris in this simulated environment. So at the start of his model run, the ocean was entirely this purple color. It's as if somebody had just sprinkled uniformly plastic debris at the surface of the ocean uniformly over the global ocean. Then he turned on the ocean currents and let them carry the debris just according to those patterns that were measured in the data. And after 10 years, the color shading here that you see shows the concentration of the debris, essentially where this debris ended up. So the highest concentrations are the reds, and what you see are these 5 accumulation zones in the North Atlantic, the North Pacific, the South Atlantic, the South Pacific, and in the Indian Ocean. So at this stage, the data set that SEA has collected, we compared to his model results. And in fact, his model is based on the same surface circulation data that I showed in the previous map. So we see a very nice correspondence. Where he predicts the highest debris would accumulate, we see it there. In the North Pacific, there have also been quite a few studies there, and we know that plastic is also concentrating here, and this is your North Pacific garbage patch. The Southern Hemisphere is a bit of a different story. There's been very little research done in the Southern Hemisphere. There is a group called 5 gyres, which has made it their mission to sample each of these 5 subtropical gyres in the ocean. And so now they have had at least one cruise that has passed through each of these zones, and in each of their cruises they have found plastic debris. So we do know that it's present, but we have to keep in mind that this map really represents a hypothesis about where these accumulation zones are. Obviously, nobody sprinkled plastic uniformly across the surface of the ocean. The sources are varied, and we don't really understand where the biggest sources are yet. But it does provide an excellent hypothesis about where you might go to look for high concentrations of plastic debris. But we're still a very long way from estimating the total amount of material that's accumulating. These do not translate to any real numbers of concentration. So let's go back to the original question. How big is the problem? So in no ocean have we determined from field data the size or the concentration of accumulation zones of floating plastic debris. Beyond the sea surface, there are very, very few data. in the upper tens of meters of the water column, although we're working on that. Nearshore surveys of the seafloors, like some of those photos I showed you earlier, show an abundance of debris, and especially trash if you look in harbors and things like that. But once you get down to the open ocean, there are very few seafloor surveys. It's very difficult to access that environment. And then trends in beach debris through regular beach surveys, for example, have found to be very highly variable. So really, we're very far from an answer to the question of how big is the problem. Okay, so the next question is the problem growing in time? Well, our data have been collected over 25 years, and they've been collected on annually repeated cruise tracks, so we're in a very good position to address this question. So the first thing is you might want to wager a guess as to whether or not you think plastic in the ocean floating at the sea surface would be increasing. Remember, we can't measure that directly, so we have to use some proxy data. So what we did is we looked at trends in the global production of plastics over time, and this as you know, has been increasing exponentially. And then we tried to get a step closer to a potential input into the ocean. So we looked at the trends in the waste generation of the plastic waste generation in the United States. And that's estimated by the US EPA annually. So what I've plotted here is the amount of plastic, all plastic materials in the US municipal solid waste stream versus year from 1960 to present, and our study takes place during this time period here. So what you're seeing is plastic waste generation. So this is how much waste are we producing. The second curve below it, the blue line, is plastic waste discards. So the difference between the two is the estimated recycling rate. So we're getting better. These lines are separating, but there's still most of the material is actually being discarded into landfills. It's being burned, or it's ending up in the environment as litter. So if you look at these curves, the increase in plastic waste generation and discards both have increased about 9.3% annually. And if you look at just the increase from the beginning to the end of our study period, the total amount has increased about 150%. So from these trends, we're inferring that more plastic waste is being created, more is probably going into the ocean, and we expected to see a strong increase in plastic concentration. Well, what we did was we looked just at the area where the plastic is accumulating in the western North Atlantic, that accumulation zone, and we looked at the change in concentration over time. So what I'm showing here is the average plastic concentration in that accumulation zone as a function of time. These are annual averages, and these are the standard error, giving you a sense of the variability around that average. And what you see is that there are very large variations year to year in that accumulation zone. It's very difficult to identify any kind of trend in these data. So we turned to statistics and actually fit a trend line to these data. And what we found is that there is a very slight increasing trend over time, but the error in that trend is very large. So in reality, we can't say if this is a slightly decreasing trend or a slightly increasing trend. The conclusion is that there is no trend, that the concentration of plastic remains steady over this 25-year period. This was really surprising. We probably spent 4 months making sure that we believed this. And no matter how you slice it and dice it, it's impossible to find a strong increase. So the data are showing a steady trend. And what that means is now we have to work really hard to try to understand why. If we want to understand why the amount of plastic at the surface is constant, again, we have to think of the amount of plastic coming into the ocean and the amount that's leaving the sea surface where we're measuring it. So we think that the amount coming in is increasing. That means the amount going out must be increasing at the same rate. And trying to understand how that's happening is completely confounding. We have some hypotheses about what might be happening. If you remember, the plastic that we're measuring at the sea surface is 1/3 of a millimeter or bigger, and we know that plastic is probably breaking down into smaller and smaller pieces that pass through the net. But that would have to be happening at a faster rate than the amount coming in. Other ideas are that we know a lot of marine mammals or marine animals are eating the plastic, but we don't really know what happens to it after it gets eaten. It could pass right through the organism. So this is really a wide open $1 million question that we just simply don't have an answer to. Now, the story is a little bit different if you look in other parts of the world. Thomson et al. Published a paper in 2004 that looked at plastic fibers measured in plankton samples along the tracks that are shown here in the British Isles and between the British Isles and Iceland. And they looked at asked the same question, is the amount of plastic increasing over time? And what they found is that the difference in the amount of plastic fibers in the seawater samples did increase dramatically between the 60s and 70s and the 80s and 90s. So you see this big jump between those decades. But you look between the 80s and 90s, and actually they don't see a difference either. So this was the title of the paper was actually Lost at Sea, Where is All the Plastic? But very recently, a paper was published by Miriam Goldstein that looked at data in the eastern North Pacific. And this study actually found that the plastic concentrations measured by number or by mass increased by about 2 orders of magnitude between these two time periods, between the 70s and 80s and the 2000s. So here we see much lower mass and plastic concentrations, and they increase quite dramatically in the subtropical ocean. So this is quite a different story. And we can't really put all the pieces together yet to understand why we're finding such different trends. Now, while we didn't observe a change in the concentration of total plastic pieces in our accumulation zone in the Atlantic, there was one very interesting and very important trend that emerged from the data, and that is the trend in the concentration of those resin pellets that I told you about earlier. So here's a picture of these resin pellets. These are, again, the sort of industrial raw material of plastics. And as I mentioned, that these are fairly easy to distinguish from the fragments in our plastic samples. So when the students are picking out plastic, they actually count the pellets separately from the plastic fragments. And up until now, what I've been reporting to you is the total number of pieces plus pellets, so everything together. Here, what we're looking at is just the trend in the concentration of pellets alone for the cruises in which they were distinguished. So an important piece of information is that in 1991, the plastics industries, their trade industry, voluntarily instituted the Pellet Retention Environmental Code, which was a commitment to the total containment of plastic pellets. And this is a code that outlined ways to prevent spillage of these pellets, either during manufacturing, processing, or transport. Now, this wasn't just out of the goodness of their hearts. This was in response to an EPA study that very clearly outlined the pathways of these pellets into the marine environment. But nonetheless, it does appear from our observations that this has had a measurable impact. So here we're looking at average pellet concentration. This is throughout our entire North Atlantic domain now over time. And what we see is a very strong, statistically significant decrease of about 91% over that 25-year period. So while the concentration of the pellets is a pretty small fraction of the total number of pieces, it can't explain our steady trend. It does indicate that, or suggest that a change in land-based behavior can have a very positive and a very measurable effect down the line in the ocean. Okay, so the third driving question, what are the impacts of plastic debris on the marine ecosystem, on human health, and on the economy? And I'm not going to touch the economy because I'm not an economist, and I don't think we're even ready to discuss that yet, but I do have a few comments on the other two. So first, in terms of the ecological impacts of plastic marine debris, there are a few very well-known impacts that we've known about for a long time. The first of those is entanglement. So it's typically larger marine organisms like marine mammals or sea turtles that get entangled by things like derelict fishing gear, lost nets, packing straps that you find that hold boxes closed. And I know I grew up cutting up plastic six-pack rings. So we've known about this problem for a long time. This is clearly a serious hazard to entangled animals who can be maimed or injured or killed because of this entanglement. What we don't know is what the population level effect is on any one group of organisms. We can document the organisms that we actually encounter that have become entangled, but we don't have a good sense of whether or not a population is becoming threatened because of it, for example. A second well-known impact is ingestion, and we often think of ingestion of plastic debris by larger organisms, again, like marine mammals or seabirds, which are sort of the poster child. But the ingestion also occurs in fish and even invertebrates. So what I'm showing here is a picture from a website. Chris Jordan is a photographer who went to Midway Island out in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands and documented albatross chick carcasses as he found them on the island. And it was very common to find a chick sort of decomposing with the gut exposed with pieces of plastic. So this is actually a cigarette lighter. This is a bottle cap. And there are lots of other different fragments and pieces of plastic that you find inside the chick. So the reason this happens is that the chicks wait in the nesting colony while the adults go out and forage. And they forage out in the open ocean and bring food and whatever else they collect, like debris, back and feed their chicks. And the chicks and the adults can actually regurgitate some of this material, but some of it can't. And so you end up with a pretty common picture like this. In Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, of course, you may remember that she describes the birds as sort of a sentinel species. When the areas were completely soaked with DDT, the birds were the first she describes very descriptively. They were the ones that disappeared. Silent Spring, in fact, that's where the title comes from. So my feeling is that perhaps these birds are the sentinel species for plastic in the ocean. On the bottom, I'm showing here a picture of a triggerfish that we collected on one of our cruises. This fish was found swimming beneath that 5-gallon bucket that I showed you earlier, and it actually came up in the net. So we dissected it and pulled out of its stomach 47 pieces of plastic fragments. And I've also been at sea when we typically tow a line to try to catch some dinner. And in the Pacific, we caught a mahi-mahi one day and did this, filleted it, sent that to the galley. And then we dissected the stomach and found sort of a plastic grid, piece of some kind of gridded material about yay big that was gray and very similar in shape and color to a fish that was also in the mahi-mahi's gut. So we did enjoy the fish. It was delicious, but it really was quite eye-opening about this problem of ingestion. So it's pretty obvious that we don't think anything should be eating plastic, but the risk is still sort of unclear. We know that some of the individuals that are ingesting large pieces could suffer internal damage. These chicks could very well have starved to death because their gut was filled up with plastic. But it's very difficult to determine the cause of death for something like this. Sort of telling, but we're not, we can't say for sure also what the population impact is of ingestion. Okay, so another known ecological impact of marine debris is the fact that this is a new substrate that we have introduced into the ocean. So the ocean has had lots of floating substrates, logs, coconuts, things that have washed into the ocean. But we've introduced a totally new substrate. And we find that many of the pieces ranging in size from these small, tiny microplastics up to large items are always colonized by either large organisms, if it's a large item. This is about a 4-inch ball, also recovered in the past week in the North Pacific. And you see there's a crab here that's taking advantage of that, as well as some barnacles. Pretty small piece of debris covered by quite some large organisms. The smaller pieces of debris often have some kind of biofilm on them. So the fact that this debris carries these organisms, it then has the ability to transport non-native and potentially invasive species across large distances in the ocean. So we do know of documented instances of non-native species that are associated with floating debris. What we don't yet know is the scale of the impact and the scale of the impact relative to other transport mechanisms. So we know, for instance, that ballast water that gets transported across ocean basins is responsible for the introduction of many invasive species. We also know that coconut out there could be transporting invasive species. So we don't know the scale of the impact, but we do know that we've introduced a large amount of this new substrate. Another sort of slant on that is some new work by colleagues of ours, Tracy Mintzer at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, Linda Amaral-Zettler at Marine Biological Laboratory, and Eric Zettler at SEA. And they're actually looking at what they call the plastosphere. What they're interested in is the diverse microbial community that is growing on these pieces of plastic. So they're really looking at the small fragments of plastic. And what they've noticed is that the organisms living on the plastic pieces in the plastosphere are very different from the microbial community that develops in the surrounding seawater or on other natural substrates like sargassum seaweed. So what you're looking at here, these are scanning electron micrographs of a couple pieces of plastic debris. And these sort of differently shaped objects are actually microbes, some of which are known. Different types of phytoplankton are easily identified, but there are also many unknown species. And it's very compelling looking at this figure. It looks like these organisms sort of burrowing into the plastic. It's unclear sort of what they're doing there, but they seem to be taking advantage of cracks, those weakened spots due to exposure in the ocean. So what these researchers did is they actually did some genetic analysis on the microorganisms found on 2 different types of plastic debris, one piece of polyethylene, one piece of polypropylene, and compared those analyses to microorganisms living in the surrounding seawater. And this Venn diagram loosely represents the number of species found and the species that they have in common on these different substrates. So you can see that they all had large numbers of species, but the number of species that actually overlap between these 3 environments is actually quite small. So it appears that the communities growing on the plastic, and in fact potentially on different types of plastic, could be quite different. So these preliminary results led to a National Science Foundation funded grant where they're asking the questions: which organisms are members of the plastosphere? What's actually growing on this? Are there potentially pathogenic species that are present and that are being transported by this debris? And what are the microbes doing there? Are they simply taking advantage of a protective habitat where you have these natural cracks? Or are they in some way physically degrading the debris? Are they actually able to sort of create these fragments? Or the big question, are they able to somehow use the carbon in the plastic as a food source and thereby biodegrade the plastic? And that is a really open question. If you talk to the polymer chemists, they will say, no way, they can't do it. If you talk to the microbial ecologists, they say these are incredible organisms that evolve at a rate we can't even imagine. And so this is why this research is really important to know if there actually is a mechanism to degrade the plastic in a relatively short time frame. So that work is in the early stages, and we'll have to stay tuned on that. Okay, and then the last known impact of debris that I want to talk about is organic pollutants. And I know this is a topic that's near and dear to many people's hearts here. We do know that some plastics act as sort of sponges for persistent organic pollutants that are already present in the ocean. So things like DDT, PCBs, and PAHs. And we also suspect that additives in the plastic material itself are also released into the marine environment, things like BPA. So these toxins have been measured on the debris, and we know that marine organisms do ingest the debris, and that animal tissues also contain many of these contaminants. But what's important to note is it's unclear how important this mechanism of transfer is, or in fact, do the toxins transfer from the plastic into the animal tissues? Or are the toxins that we find in the tissues there because of the prey that they've eaten or because of their exposure in seawater? So this is very difficult to tease apart because the transfer of the contaminants to animal tissue depends on a number of factors: the type of the polymer, the type of contaminant, the presence of other particles that might have sort of a stronger sorptive property, the degradation state of the plastic, et cetera. So it's pretty much impossible to tell the source of the contaminants from the contaminants themselves in the tissues. So while the scientific evidence is not yet conclusive on this, I think there is certainly reason for concern, and we might consider this a strong case for the implementation of the precautionary principle. Let's assume it's doing harm until proven otherwise. So these things that I've talked about are known ecological impacts, and it's entirely possible that there could be other impacts that we have not yet discovered. Okay, let's talk a couple minutes about ecological impacts and how they may extend to impacts on human health. So the first issue is the issue of public safety. The most likely place for the public, for you and I, to encounter marine debris is on beaches. And so exposure to dangerous or contaminated materials could be a risk. And an extreme example of this, some of you may remember, is the medical waste that washed ashore on the beaches in New York and New Jersey in the 1980s. I grew up in southern New York and remember staying away from the beaches as a kid because of this, syringes washing up. That's not so much an issue anymore, but a current issue is the debris from the 2011 Japanese tsunami. And folks on the West Coast in Alaska are very concerned about this. And there has been concern about potential radioactive contamination of the debris. The second risk, to those of you who are boaters, is the risk of debris as a hazard to navigation. And our ships have had to cut lost fishing nets off of our propellers in the middle of the Great Blue Sea. So this is actually quite a serious hazard. The next risk is through the contamination of seafood. So as I just discussed, there's been a lot of concern and speculation about plastic serving as a way to concentrate these organic pollutants and transfer them into the food web. So we know, again, we know that the plastic will sorb those pollutants, and we know that those pieces are getting ingested, but we really are quite far from being able to draw that link to seafood and the human food supply. I did eat the mahi-mahi. Okay, one of the questions that the plastosphere researchers are looking at is whether or not the debris is associated with pathogens. So some of their preliminary analysis did show the presence of Vibrio species, and Vibrio is a genus that has several members that are known human and animal pathogens. So this has raised some interest, and they're going to follow up on that. And then again, I mentioned the concern about potential radioactivity carried on Japanese debris that so far has not been detected. And then the last impact on human health really is the threat to ocean health in general. This is the threat to Rachel Carson's balance of nature. So we're changing the composition and potentially the functioning of the marine ecosystem. And this could certainly bring consequences that are not yet known to humans and to human health. Okay, last driving question has to do with the question about how long will this threat continue? Imagine that today we stop putting all plastic into the marine environment. What are the long-term risks associated with plastic debris? So the question really is, what is the fate of plastic in the marine environment? Well, as I mentioned earlier, we don't know the lifetime of plastics in the ocean. We haven't done those experiments. And we don't understand the degradation mechanisms or the timescales on which they occur in the marine environment. And so this, again, is another area of research that's really wide open. What we do know, this is sort of our hypothesis. We know that most of the plastic in the ocean is beginning its life as a large item, like a plastic canister or a plastic bag. And this is a model that was created by Richard Thomson, sort of a conceptual model to say, let's look at how the surface area of plastic debris changes as these items are broken down, as they get weathered by exposure to sunlight and break down into smaller pieces. So here is the surface area, starting surface area of the plastic canister. This is the plastic bag. And over time, as you break into more and more pieces, you're exposing more and more of that surface area to the ocean, to seawater. So as a result of that, we think that you're actually now you have a larger surface area exposed to sorb those chemicals, so the chemical transport is going to increase over time. And as you break these pieces down into smaller and smaller pieces, the risk of ingestion goes up for many, many more organisms. They're more available to a wider range of organisms. So while we don't yet know the time scale or the ultimate fate of the plastic materials, whether or not they ultimately get degraded in the marine environment, we do hypothesize that the risk of this material does increase with age or with exposure. So these are four very, very big and very basic questions. And I have to say there are surprisingly few scientists actively researching the answers. This is quite a small research field right now. So what are we doing at SEA? Well, we continue to collect data on every single sea semester cruise, 10 to 12 cruises per year in the North Atlantic and in the North Pacific Oceans. And actually right now we're conducting our second dedicated research expedition dedicated solely to studying plastic debris. So our ship, the Robert C. Siemens, is out there sailing from San Diego to Hawaii. And the crew consists of 26 SEA alums from the 1970s to last year, and the professional crew. And this expedition aims to not only measure plastic concentrations like we've been doing for so many years, but many of the research goals are now focused on investigating the effects of plastic in the ocean ecosystem. So we're really looking carefully at the things that are growing on materials large and small. We're collecting samples for those microbial analyses. We're looking out for potential tsunami debris. And we're also looking at some of the physical processes that will mix the plastic away from the sea surface into the water column so we can get better estimates of the total amount of plastic concentration in the ocean. We do have a dedicated website. This is a snapshot of part of the homepage that's listed right here. And we have daily updates on the Expedition Journal, where you can read a blog and you can see daily slideshows of the findings. We also have a school email exchange. We have 10 partner schools where students are sending questions to the crew, and the crew are sending answers back, and they're getting posted on here. And we do have twice weekly videos as well from sea. And then our journalist, Jonathan Waterman, is on board. He's also posting to the National National Geographic on Mondays with blogs from sea. So if you're interested, I encourage you to check out the website. There's also a link to our 2010 North Atlantic expedition. So just to wrap up, now that you've heard my scientific assessment of the so-called garbage patches, you may be wondering if this is just a hyped-up environmental problem since there's no floating landfill out there. And one of the common questions I get is, well, why can't we just clean it up? Well, if there were very large floating islands of trash, large trash heaps, it would be relatively easy, given the resources, to go out there with some barges and scoop it up and bring it back to shore. But instead, we're faced with an ocean that's filled with relatively dilute fragments of plastic that are generally smaller than your smallest fingernail. So even if it were feasible to tow nets and strain out the entire ocean to remove the plastic, you would actually be removing the base of the food web as well, plankton and other organisms that are equivalent size. So you could do more harm than good to the ocean ecosystem by trying to clean it up through a well-intentioned effort. In fact, this is a photo of, I don't know if anybody's heard of the vac from the sea, but this was a program by Electrolux to actually build a vacuum from recovered ocean plastics. And what they found was that they had to take plastic from the beach. But they did, in fact, build a vacuum cleaner from beach debris. So we can't just clean up the problem, but we do have to stop it from getting worse. So the next natural question is, well, let's just create these new materials that would prevent the problem from getting worse. And there's a whole class of materials out there that are loosely termed biopolymers. So I urge some caution in thinking about these materials because they do come in a number of flavors. There are some that are considered bio-based or biomass plastics. And those are plastics in which the carbon originates from biological and presumably biorenewable sources. So instead of making plastic from petroleum, which is the traditional material, you might make it from corn, for instance, from corn stalk. So while these materials may reduce the carbon footprint of plastics, they are actually chemically identical to plastics made from petroleum. So really, the impacts are exactly the same. The second class of materials are often referred to as biodegradable. Again, caution whenever you see that term. What they're designed to do is actually to fragment. They're designed to easily fragment into small pieces. But again, these small pieces are still polymers. So in fact, what you're doing now is you're creating these really small pieces that could potentially be doing more harm than a large plastic bag drifting out there. So this is not going to be the answer either. In order for a material to be truly biodegradable, what that means is that microorganisms have to be able to break the material down into carbon dioxide, water, and inorganic compounds within the time frame of a year. This is a new standard that has actually just been put into place. The third class of materials are materials such as polylactic acid, or PLA, that actually have been shown to fully biodegrade. But they've been shown to fully biodegrade only in very specific environments, such as industrial composting facilities. So these have not been tested in the marine environment. It's not known whether or not they will biodegrade, or if they do, how long that would take. There are also concerns that this could potentially contaminate the recycling system if you start mixing these materials in. So the bottom line in terms of the marine environment, I think, is that we are the solution. We are all consumers of these products that we're finding out there in bits and pieces. And in my opinion, the only reasonable approach is to control the flow of this material at the source. So what that means is really, first and foremost, we have to reduce consumption through our changes in consumer habits, and especially in the reduction of single-use packaging, which permeates our lives. So that reduce first and foremost, reuse when you can, and then thirdly, recycle. And so just my parting thought, in Silent Spring, Rachel Carson makes a point about chemical agents, that we've created these materials in man's search for a better and easier way of life. And I think plastics fall into that category as well. And while they clearly have many beneficial uses, we really rely on them in many uses, and they indeed have improved our lives, we do have to ask ourselves if things like single-use or disposable items that have become such an accepted part of our daily lives and that are an important part of our economy, are really worth the price. Finally, I just have to end with acknowledgements for my co-authors on the SEA work. Skye Murray Ferguson spent a year of her life digging through ancient data sheets and archived plastic samples and outdated data files to try to assemble that data set that ended up being that beautiful dot plot of 6,600 points. Dr. Giora Proskorowski, Dr. Christopher Reddy, and Emily Peacock were co-authors on that work as well. Dr. Nikolai Maximenko and Jan Hafner at University of Hawaii contributed a lot of the physical oceanography to our work, putting the pieces of the ocean currents together with the plastic concentrations. And then Dr. Amaral Zettler, and Mincer shared their data on that plastosphere data, which has not yet been published. But most importantly, this work would not have been possible without the dedication of more than 4,000 sea semester students, shipboard crew and faculty, and the innumerable hours spent picking more than 100,000 pieces of plastic from plankton nets. Thank you.